Good afternoon. My name is Mark Shafer. I'd like to welcome you to the Carnegie Historical Museum here in the top floor of the old library building. We have Mike Burgraaf with us here today. He's a board member with us on the museum board and has a considerable knowledge of crockery produced here in the state of Iowa. I think Southeast Iowa is a specialty. I'm not sure, but we'll find out. So, Mike, I sure appreciate you doing this for us, and I'm sure our viewers and the people who are here today will really enjoy what you have to tell us.
Okay.
So welcome aboard.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. I appreciate the people that made it through the somewhat bad weather to get here today. So what I'll try to do is give a good variety of stoneware utensils to show you and the history of the manufacture. And I think that some of you may be able to recall some of the pieces, either from your own use or perhaps from a relative or mother or grandmother's use. So maybe we can bring back some hopefully fond memories with some of these pieces. A lot of the pieces are local. I've collected stoneware from Iowa since about 1980 and have tried to come up with what I consider a good variety. Variety tends to make a better collection. That's what I tried to do with the display today, is bring a wide variety of items, hopefully a few things that you haven't seen before. I'll also be asking the audience a question from time to time, so please don't be shy. If you think you know the answer or you want to participate, I'll be glad to get you in there. Also, if you have a question about anything that I'm talking about, please feel free to ask, because I'll be more than happy to try to answer that question for you. First of all, the stoneware utensils that I have here, the majority of them were used for everyday use in the family. Stoneware is a very common use for utilitarian use, such as holding milk, pickles, for canning purposes, vinegar. There's almost an endless use for stoneware and crockeryware. As I go through some of these examples that we have here, we'll show some of the contents, or at least explain what some of the contents were used in these different containers. And before we get into that, though, I want to start with the manufacture. Now, first of all, if you can visualize this, stoneware goes back for probably thousands of years. It's one of the oldest mediums that we have as far as a manufacturing enterprise. In Iowa, which most of us have some of a idea how things were 150 years ago when people were first coming into this state, there was a need for stoneware utensils. And obviously, there were no potteries in the state because we were such a young state at that time, the 1830s, 1840s, if you can visualize that time period. Most of the stoneware that was brought into the state came from out east. That's where a lot of the potteries were more prominent, New York and Pennsylvania and the Ohio areas. That's why every now and then you'll see a piece from those areas that will turn up. It'll be marked from New York or Ohio. And people always wonder, well, how the heck did it get clear out to Iowa? It was brought here. And that's what they used until some of the early pioneers, the ones that had previous experience at some of these eastern potteries, left those potteries, came to Iowa, and started their own. This one die cut that I have shown here will kind of help show what some of the smaller potteries look like, and I'll try to pass this around a little bit. But first of all, they're almost entirely located on a river or a creek. And for obvious reasons, that's where your best choice or your closest choice of clay would be. Now, there are a couple of potters in Iowa that actually ship their clay in. When I get to this one particular crock, I'll explain that, but he had his clay shipped in from 50 miles away. And during the 1860s and 1870s, that was a considerable amount of labor to have that done. Because most of us have tried shoveling clay before, and it's not an easy, not a fun task. So first of all, they had to locate a good clay bed. There's lots of clay in Iowa, but you have to have the right kind of clay. The potters that had the experience knew what to look for. And Iowa has an abundance of good clay for this purpose. Once they located a good clay bed, the next thing they had to do was build the necessary furniture, the buildings that would be necessary to make this. In this cut, and this die cut is from the 1875 Historical Atlas of Iowa. This particular pottery is of the William Meyer Pottery Works in Eddyville, Iowa. I don't happen to have an example here. They're extremely hard to come by. But you can notice a tall, cone-shaped kiln over here. That's very typical of the kilns that they had on their site. You also notice that there's only one kiln. Some of the potteries may have had 2 or 3 or even as many as 4 if they were a big-time operation. Most of them, this kiln was not an easy building to build. It took some time. The brick walls had to be considerably thick because when I get into the manufacture, you'll see why they had to be so thick. And it has to have a tall stack on it, and I'll explain why it has to have a tall stack on it as well. Now, some of the other buildings that they have here, once the pottery was made, they had to have a drying shed, a place where the pottery would cure. Because if you can use your imagination here, what would happen if you took a piece of pottery that still had some moisture content in it, in the clay, place it in the kiln, and we're going to fire this up to around 2,000 degrees. There's some moisture in there. You're not going to have any stoneware left when you go to check it when it is done. Now, I'm going to ask a question here. These clay beds that we talked about, do you think they could use it straight out of the ground? Probably not. Most of them did not. Some did, and those that used it straight out of the ground and didn't do any pre-processing to it, their wares have a tremendously crude look to it, and some of it didn't last very long because if there's impurities in the clay, like small pebbles, those expand and contract at a different rate, so during the firing process, lots of their wares would get broke simply during the firing process because of those impurities. I've got a small jug in here. I've got the case locked up right now, but you'll see a small piece of stoneware that may break out on it, and underneath you may see a little pebble there. And that's because that particular potter didn't take the time to grind his clay. I don't know how many of you have read in the paper, I think it's been about 2 years ago, the Bentonsport pottery was recently excavated down there. And one of the neat things that they found in the middle of the pottery works was this large circular trench. It was probably anywhere from 1.5 to 2 feet deep. And it was a rather large diameter trench. Now the reason that trench was there is a horse made that trench. This horse was hooked up to a mechanism that ran a paddle around and round inside this big bin. Inside this big bin was the clay. The horse would walk around and round and round all day long, grinding and mixing this clay down to get rid of the impurities. Now some potters would just simply grind it down to get rid of the impurities. Others would grind it down until it was a powder. And then they would take the powder and they would add the water to that. And they would have a very high quality clay. The ones that didn't take that time didn't get all the impurities out. But it's very evident what that trench was used for because it was like I said, it was close to 2 feet deep. Now you can understand the boredom for the poor animal. They had to walk around and round and round, and the number of turns it would have taken to create a trench that deep. So you kind of feel sorry for the animal, but that was his job, and that was, unfortunately for him, the best way to get the clay to that consistency that they needed. Now, most of you probably have an idea how these utensils were made. I'll ask an easy question. Does anybody know how, for instance, if we want to make a stoneware crock such as this, how do you get the round shape that we would like to get here? We've dug a piece of clay up out of the ground. It's put it on a wheel? Put it on a wheel, a potter's wheel. And when we're thinking about the time period, 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, these were all hand, or I should say foot driven, similar to what a sewing machine would have, a foot-treadle. And the potter's wheel would rotate. He would place his clay, and if he was a good potter, he would know exactly how much clay to place on that wheel to make a 4-gallon crock, a 5-gallon crock, a 1-gallon crock, a 1-gallon jug. He would know exactly how much to take so he would get the right size container. Other potters that weren't experienced or ones that were more precise would weigh their clay. So much clay was needed to make whatever particular size crock that you wanted. So you take this ball of clay, it's placed on the potter's wheel, which is of course rotating with the treadle. And anybody that's ever tried the potter's art, it's not as easy as it sounds. So when you look at these actually gracefully looking pieces of stoneware,
There by the handle.
this is a real good example. I'm glad you brought that out. This small imperfection here, we actually have a piece of stone we're missing here. That's probably where a small pebble was. This particular crock was made from the clay that was shipped in 50 miles away, believe it or not. So wherever he was getting his clay, this one evidently didn't have all the impurities out of it.
Is that the true color of the clay?
It's kind of deceiving because it's been fired. Once it's been fired in the kiln, it comes out a little bit different color. So that's what the original color, that's a little hard to tell. But when you have a hand-turned piece of stoneware, the giveaway, in other words, how you can tell you have a piece of hand-turned stoneware, and I'll take this piece as an example, and most of you probably know what this piece was used for.
Churn.
It's a churn, great. If you look closely in the light, you can see horizontal ribs on this. This is from the potter's hands as he formed this on the wheel and as he brought this up. So if you can use your imagination.
Well, why is it two colored?
How's it two? Oh, good question. I'll answer that in just a little bit. So as he's pulling this up, his fingers are leaving these horizontal grooves on this piece. The good potters tried to only leave those grooves on the inside because you can't see those, and you can feel them. They're very pronounced on the inside. But on the outside, the mark of a good potter, he'd try not to have those so visible. These are pretty visible. Now, to answer your question about the discoloration, this piece was probably set too close to another piece of stoneware in the kiln. And that's why you have the discoloration, because you have a different temperature, or else it was next to the wall in the kiln. So you have a little bit different temperature. There's a lot of things that could have caused this. So.
How did he make the handles? Because he was fiddling and everything.
Okay, once this was turned to that shape, and you have to understand, the taller the item, the harder it is to make. And keep this in mind, they made 20-gallon crocks this way. And the largest one I have here is a 4-gallon crock. And some of you have probably seen a 20-gallon crock. That's a pretty large container. And to turn that on a potter's wheel, that would have been quite a feat.
Use it for Crock.
Right, exactly. So anyway, to answer your question about the handles, these were the same type of clay. They were just hand applied later. Same way with this. This is a hand-turned jug, and if I can get that just in the right light, you can see the horizontal marks on that as well. The handle, of course, was applied later. That was applied by hand, and a lot of times, if he was good, you won't see the imprint so bad. Some of them, you'll see great big thumb imprints there. It just depends on if you had an apprentice or if you had the head potter making that piece.
But now this has to be put on before it's fired.
Oh yeah, everything has to be done before it's fired. And I'll get into the different colors or different glazes again. Again, we have a hand-turned jug, and usually when you have a beehive jug, a round top jug, which is what this is, they almost always are hand-turned. This is a hand-turned jug. It happens to be from Fort Madison, Iowa. It's debossed here on the shoulder, Stallarns, and they owned a bottling works there in Fort Madison, late 1870s and 1880s, and they also had their own brickyard. And they started to put out their own apple cider around 1880, and instead of having one of the local potters make their jugs for them, they made their own jugs right at the brick plant. so they saved themselves some money. I don't know if they were just not proud or else their name was extremely well known down there, because their name is the only thing on the jug. They didn't bother to put Fort Madison on there, so I'm not sure why that was, but the interesting thing about this jug is once it was formed, and this is one of these characteristics that you look for when you're trying to date a jug, how do you get the jug off the potter's wheel? You can cut it off. One of the earlier methods, and I'll pass this around so you can see this, it has a string mark. If you can visualize this jug as it's rotating on this, they would take a piece of string and pull it across the base, and you can see the irregular grooves that this piece of string caused as they separated it from the wheel. And any earlier piece like this is a telltale mark that you're going to see on it, and it's one of those neat characteristics that you'll see. If you look close, you can see right where each string crossed. And they call that a string mark. Now normally the bases of these jugs and crocks are smooth. So it's actually kind of a, well, I'll say it's not nearly as common to see those string marks. Now as far as the glazes, you notice we got a lot of different colors up here. We basically have 3 different glazes, but we've got much more than that for color. This particular crock, or jug I should say, this jug, this crock, and this crock, and lastly, this jug. I'll get rid of the churn for right now. All of these examples are salt-glazed. And this is the earliest type of glazing that they used on stoneware. So you can imagine all this stoneware inside the kiln, when it's being fired, and it's being fired at around 2200 degrees, depending on who the potter is. They had slight variances in that. When it got to that peak temperature and they started to cool the kiln down, they threw salt inside the kiln, or borax. Those are the 2 things that they used, salt and borax. And when that was thrown inside the kiln, keep in mind the temperature, it liquefied, and the chemical reaction between the salt vaporizing and the surface of the stoneware caused it to get this surface, which is a real fine orange peel. It's very pronounced on this large beehive jug. And if you look closely at it, in fact, you can see the little bit of discoloration here where it got a little overly fired. It has this kind of wrinkled finish, just like you do on an orange. Some people call it orange peel, but that's the salt glaze, and that's the oldest type. That was pretty much phased out by the 1890s. Most of the potters had quit using the salt glaze. The main reason, when that salt was thrown in there, it caused extremely toxic fumes. So that was one of the dangerous operations of the potter. The jug that we have here that we've already shown from Fort Madison, this is what they call an Albany slip. And basically what that is it's just liquid clay. Instead of having the clay they used to make the jug, they water it down and water it down. And then they would have this in a barrel. They would take the jug and they would dip that into that barrel. They would glaze the inside, swirl it around, pour out the excess. The entire outside would be glazed. In fact, if you look at some jugs, you can see where they held onto it with their finger, because that particular place underneath will not have any glazing on it. And also, on this one, you can see where the finger marks were when he gripped it. The oil from his hands was left on the stoneware, and the glaze didn't take.
And this is before it goes in the kiln.
This is before it goes in the kiln. Stoneware has to be glazed, and then that has to dry. You have to make sure it has to be dry. The earliest forms of identifying the stoneware is the Cobalt decoration that you see on this 5-gallon jug. And this was hand decorated. If you remember back to your early years, kindergarten, first grade, finger painting. This is a more refined version of it, but the liquid cobalt, this was hand decorated on there. When you get out east in Pennsylvania, you'll see really elaborate pieces with eagles. Some of them actually painted the stoneware factory on the front of it. They get really elaborate. But the hand decorated piece with cobalt, those are the earliest forms. This particular piece, when you look at it, it's got probably the darkest cobalt, or the more pronounced of the ones that we have here. I've got one here that I've kind of been holding back on you. And this particular one is a 4-gallon crock. It was made at Cedar Falls by Martin White. And as you look around the display, we've got some Fort Dodge stoneware over here. Martin White was in Cedar Falls from 1859 to 1869. This is a fellow that had his clay shipped in from 50 miles. He had a series of family tragedies and a few monetary problems. He moved to Fort Dodge in 1870 and found a fantastic bed of clay of really high quality. And Fort Dodge eventually became the biggest pottery in Iowa. And Martin White was the one that started that. And eventually was taken over by his sons. But anyway, it is stamped up top here with his name, Martin White. And we don't know if Martin White actually stamped that on there, but that is a steel stamp that made the debossing here. And it's probably hard to see where you're at. And it also says Cedar Falls. The wreath here, the cobalt decoration, and then this is kind of a mystery. And I've shown this to a lot of stoneware collectors, and nobody seems to be able to agree on what the purpose or meaning of this word is. We think, I mean, the obvious thing is, it looks like the word yellow. And why that word is on a stoneware crock, we have no idea. I'll be more than happy to entertain any.
What's the first letter?
Why?
We think it's a Y. Now some people say, well, it says tallow. Well,
Like a T from here.
yeah, I know, and we've had that, but then I've had other people say, no, that's a Y. So I'm not going to argue with anybody about what it says, but you can certainly entertain your own version of it.
Maybe that was the first one that made for us.
That may be. That may be. Now the other thing you have to think about here, the reason you don't see as many cobalt decorated pieces, this took time. Stoneware was rather inexpensive. It had to be cranked out on a high production in order for the potter to make money. Because this was done basically, the firing of the pottery is done during the warmer months of the year. During the cold months, they didn't fire pottery, they were gathering firewood to get ready for next season's stoneware batch. Because it took an incredible amount of firewood to keep these kilns going. If you hand decorated...
These designs painted, what stage in the pottery? After they had dried?
Okay, this had to be, of course, formed first, and then the salt glaze, in this case, on this piece, was done later when it was being fired. The cobalt was done prior to that. They were decorated prior to being...
The final firing?
Right. Today, a lot of potters will do a two-step process. Back then, they did it all in one shot. They wanted to get everything done in one shot because, as I explained how they fired the kilns, you understand why they didn't want to do it 2 times. It was quite an ordeal. Now, if you can visualize this inside this kiln, and from this picture you might get an idea how big this kiln is. They filled this thing with stoneware. Bowls, crocks, jugs, whatever they happened to be making for that particular local market. They would take the larger pieces, turn them upside down, and they would be stacked on the floor, and they would take progressively smaller pieces until they had these stacks, these tiers of stoneware inside the kiln.
Oh, they weren't shelved then.
Oh no, nope. They were all stacked on top of each other. As high as they could get it without them falling over. And then I've got one more thing to add. sometimes on an older piece you can see where the other piece sat on top of. In this case, it's kind of unusual because it's such a small piece. You would have thought they would have, this is a 4-gallon crock, you would have thought they'd put a 3-gallon, then a 2-gallon, and so forth. That's the general way, but not always. And sometimes you'll see a large crock and it may have like 4 smaller items that had been set on top of it. Now some of you are probably thinking, boy, if you had a stack of stoneware this high, what's going to keep it from falling over, from teetering over? That was a problem. And that's where these came in. And you're saying, that's one of the ugliest looking things I think I've ever seen. What this is called, and if you want a technical term for it, it's called a wad. And all this is a piece of raw clay that the potter took, squeezed it in his hand, flattened the ends, and stuck it between the stacks of stoneware. And you get a wide variety. Now the neat thing about the wads, if you look closely at these, and I'll pass these around, the potter's fingerprints are on these. And it's kind of a, depends on how you look at it, it's kind of a eerie or kind of a neat feeling. You pass this around, his fingerprints are here for all time. We just don't have a real good way of identifying whose fingerprints they belong to. This particular one here, you can see the groove where it was probably placed right on the rim of a crock. And we'll pass a couple of these around, and they have been fired, so it was a one-time deal. All these stacks of stoneware and all the wads, they were all knocked off and they were thrown out back in the shard pile. These were excavated from an 1860s stoneware dump.
We've got some of these down at Kissaquah in the museum.
Right, exactly.
A bunch of them.
And yeah, they're real common, and some people say, well, what do you keep those for? The historical significance of them.
I never realized how much, yeah.
Right, I mean,
Helped me a lot.
yeah,
I
they're,
can explain it.
yeah, they're great.
Yeah.
Now, to give you an idea how much stoneware was broken during the firing process and how many of these wads they used, this particular stoneware dump this stoneware was only in existence for about 6 years. The depth of this shard dump, and they threw everything right over the bank of the river. They threw pretty much everything over the bank of the river back then. This stoneware company threw all their rejects, all the broken items, all the wads were thrown over. And the depth of this, we never did get to the bottom of it. It was at least 5 to 6 feet where we were at. Probably had a length of 50 some yards down the river. Went down into the river, we don't know how far. And that's for a stoneware company that was only in existence for 6 years and had an unbelievable amount of broken material. Because obviously through the firing process, some of these things were broken. Now we've got a couple of unusual things. These were excavated at the same place. This is called a kiln tester. In other words, they rolled out a piece of the clay to make sure it had the right firing capabilities. If you get the wrong type of clay, it's not going to fire. And you can have a kiln full of stoneware, and if it's out of the wrong clay, they just wasted a lot of time. Because to get this kiln to the right consistency, it took about 4 days to get it up to that right temperature. And then it was sealed up. The entryway into the kiln was sealed up, and then it was left that way for another 2 to 3 days. And then they had to let it cool down for 2 to 4 days. So the entire firing process for the stoneware, this kiln that's stacked full of stoneware, took about 8 to 10 days. So whoever was tending the kiln had a very important job, and usually it was left in the hands of the sons, the younger ones, and the consequences would be severe for anybody that did not do their job tending the kiln, because you could ruin an entire batch of stoneware. And that was their livelihood, selling the stoneware. Now to give you, yeah.
Do you have an idea how many people it took to fire the kiln?
From what stories I've heard and be able to, the documentation of that is pretty slim. There just isn't a whole lot of that, but for a kiln this size, you basically have 2 to 3 people that are involved in doing that. And once it is to that temperature, they left one person there to tend it. So he was in charge of that. And it usually had a 12-hour shift. and then somebody else came in. Because it had to be watched the entire time. Now, as far as the cost of the stoneware, and this you may not believe, but for instance, a 4-gallon crock probably cost between 15 and 20 cents. The range of the stoneware ranged anywhere from 2 to 5 cents a gallon. And a rather inexpensive article from the times, but the potters, if they were good, could crank out a lot of stoneware. In the one cabinet, we've got a drain tile from the R.M. Dixon pottery down in Vernon. The R.M. Dixon pottery is one of the more prominent potteries, and in 1870, I looked up the census records to see what the production was on this particular company, and they produced over 1 million gallons of stoneware in 1 year. That's an incredible amount of stoneware. As a result, you will find more examples of the Vernon pottery than you will of some of the others. Now, we've talked about the Cobalt decoration. We've shown you some jugs that have the debossing on them, such as the Bonaparte piece here. This has a real small print on it. We've talked about the Stallarns jug. We've got another jug here that has a different form of identification, and this was a stencil. Now, this one's not as clear, but this is a jug from Oskaloosa. This particular fellow was a liquor dealer, Nugent Verveer, liquor dealers from Oskaloosa. They were in business from about 1897 to 1900 as far as this partnership goes. Mr. Verveer left around 1900. In fact, he left Oskaloosa and nobody knows what happened to him. As you look at this jug, you might say, well, what's this glob on here for? And if you notice this jug too, you can see there's a number of those. In the stoneware fraternity, those are referred to as tadpoles or turkey droppings. And I think you don't need to use your imagination too much on that. But what those were impurities in the salt, or an impurity that may have been, or like a piece of mortar that may have fell off the ceiling of the kiln and landed on one of the pieces. There's a number of things that could have caused this. This is just basically an impurity in the salt, and it leaves these, what some people may say, unsightly blemishes, and what I think is it adds an incredible amount of character to the jug. But anyway, this particular jug, if you look at it, it's domed out on the inside, or on the bottom side, I should say. There are also some initials on the bottom of it. They'll be hard for you to see. R.I.P. And it's not for rest in peace, although it is a liquor jug. It's from the Rock Island Pottery Company in Rock Island. And the reason they made this jug the way they did, especially for a liquor dealer, these jugs, by the way, are fairly rare, fairly hard to come by. I'll place this jug there. And you're probably wondering, well, if they're that hard to come by, how come I have two of them? And if you can visualize this in his liquor store, they're a stacking jug, and they could stack these up, these 1-gallon jugs. Now I've got another example of a stenciled piece. Quiz time real quick. What type of glaze do we have here? Salt-Glazed, yeah. Yep, everybody got that one right. It's a Salt-Glazed. Somebody's saying, well, it looks kind of funny. Those are just some differences in the glaze because we've got a different pottery now. But if you look at the detail on this particular stencil, this one was pretty elaborate. In fact, this particular potter also has been known to put eagles on his stoneware. Eli Brunson was a potter at Fairport. In fact, if you look at the business directories, business listings for Fairport, 90% of the people listed in Fairport were potters. That was a big pottery town. Now, it's over on the shores of the Mississippi River. And there are lots of examples of Fairport pottery because of that. There were several potteries in that small town. If you drive through Fairport today, you wouldn't believe it, because there's just not much there. Now we'll take kind of a local piece here, kind of, and we're going to switch glazes. I've had the Salt-Glazed, I've had the Albany slip. Now we have what you're probably more familiar with, because it's the newer type glaze which came in around the turn of the century. And this is the almost all white glaze, and that's called a Bristol or a zinc glaze. And that came in about the turn of the century. Also, around the turn of the century, because Salt-Glazed was being phased out, the debossing was being phased out, the Cobalt decoration was completely phased out, they used steel stamps to roll on the identification. They would dip the steel stamp in the Cobalt and rub that on, press that on. Now I've got a couple examples at home where this has been smeared. In fact, I've got an example here I'll show you. We'll have some speculation on how come it looks the way it does. But if I hold my hand over this particular advertising, which is from the Jones Brothers up at Richland, the Jones Brothers partnership went out in 1904. And then just the one brother continued to run that grocery store. If we take away this advertising, and this particular crock was made at Monmouth, Illinois. This is, it doesn't say that, but this is their logo. A 4-gallon crock such as this probably cost at this time about 4 cents a gallon. So we're looking at a cost to the Jones Brothers of about 16 cents for each 4-gallon crock. Now, for an extra penny a gallon, we'll put your logo on there for a mere penny a gallon. Now, there's one catch to that. You had to order 1,000 gallons of Stoneware so you didn't have to pay for the steel stamp. There's an article on these Heston jugs from Fairfield, and there's a documentation of an order to the Western Stoneware Company for 200 jugs. 5-gallon jug. They ordered 200. There's your 1,000 gallons. That way they didn't have to pay for the stamp charge, because somebody has to make that steel stamp, which was quite an art in itself. Now we've got kind of a little butter tub here, a little butter crock or a lard crock. Could have been used for a number of things. And one of the ways you can tell if your piece of stoneware is in fairly good condition is to listen for the ring. This one is solid as a bell, so to speak. And it's got that nice ring to it. So the quality is there. It's a good piece of stoneware. It's from the Ottumwa Brick and Construction Company. And as we look at that mark, we wonder, was it early in the morning? Was it late in the day on a Friday? Or was it an apprentice that was just starting out? Because it's pretty difficult to read this mark. Whoever put it on had a heck of a time. And this was probably a second. Since it didn't have a good mark, they probably sold it at a second, which means they probably sold it at a penny a gallon cheaper to the local market, most likely. They wouldn't have sold this as one of their top-end pieces. And they had factory seconds from the stoneware companies that they sold, just like they do today with lots of merchandise. So, but as far as the quality, got that nice ring to it. If it's got a crack in it, you're not going to get that ring, even if you can't see it. It'll sound like a rotten pumpkin when you hit it. So. Now, about the only other piece here that I'll show here before I close my end here. This is a common, actually called a milk crocks, is what I've more commonly refer these to. A lot of people call them stoneware bowls. Well, both are basically correct. If you look at this, you've probably seen dozens, and when you collect stoneware, you see hundreds of these. A very, very common piece of stoneware. On the bottom, and when you say you have a signed piece of stoneware, this one that's stamped Stallarns, this one is stamped Martin White, this one is stamped Parker and Hamback, Bonaparte, Iowa. Any one of the workers at that pottery could have stamped that on there. Martin White himself, we don't know if he stamped this himself, because it was a steel stamp and he made the debossing in it with that steel stamp. This particular piece is truly hand signed. George E. Turley, Ottumwa, Iowa. And he signed that after this was glazed, so it would scratch through the glaze. And like I say, you've seen 100 bowls like this, and I myself was the same, and I used to not check them. And I turn every one over now, but I doubt that I'll probably ever see another one.
Put the year.
It would have been real nice if he would have done that, so.
Well, how could they scratch through the glaze?
It was prior to it being fired.
What?
Prior to it being fired. They dipped it in the barrel of the, in this case, it was probably sprayed on because it's the newer zinc glaze. They did spray some of these glazes on. And then after it dried somewhat, not completely, but somewhat, I don't know what he used, whether he used a nail or what, but something that was fairly fine because he did a nice job, and that was inscribed just enough to scratch through the glaze.
How's the name spelled?
The Turley name is spelled T-U-R-L-E-Y. And it's one of those rare pieces that, like I say, is truly signed.
Oh, that's good writing.
Yeah, that's fancy. Oh, we have one jug here that is in the museum collection that's actually got quite a bit of charm and character, and J.M. Shafer is a name that's been hand painted on it, and then around the top it says Merry Christmas 1883. We've taken what is a very common utilitarian jug without the painting. This is like a 2-cent or a 1-cent jug, this little quart jug, and someone has put the hand painting on there and made it a very unique part of Fairfield's history, because Dr. Joshua Shafer was very influential in this town in getting the library, the building that we're standing in now, getting this library started. He used to house the library collection, this is in the 1860s, at his doctor's office. And he would open this up for the general public on Saturdays, free of charge. He didn't take a dime for his services or for the use of his office space for the library. And then he did move to Keokuk around 1875, but he always kept an active interest in Fairfield's interest, particularly the library. So this was returned back to the museum. I think the date on the label is 1893 from the Shafer family. So this now resides in the museum collection. So
It's ever been with it all the time.
I assume it has. So the label, what's kind of amusing, it says it's full of United States air. So,
That's cute.
now, as far as the other pieces of stoneware that we have displayed, I tried to get a range of items most commonly used in the kitchen. Some of the fancier bowls, the Sponge-Ware bowl. Any of you happen to know what this was used for?
Salt.
Right, the salt crock.
Show them the rounded bottom.
That's a good point. The inside of this has a concave bottom. It's rounded instead of being flat like most of the crocks. But it's a cute size because of how small it is, and the blue band that's very, very typical. These also came with advertising on a lot of them. We'll quiz you again here. What type of glaze are we guessing here?
That's for Jill Pickles.
Well, it very well it could have, because that's what it is. It is a canning jar. It's about a 2-gallon canning jar, and it has a salt glaze as well. This probably dates about 1870 because of the form. And then we can slide down to this example that has the zinc lid on it, and that is a stoneware fruit jar. Why make them out of stoneware, by the way? How much sunlight will penetrate this piece? And that was the hope. That
Isn't there for applesauce?
applesauce, Heinz Company, the big H.J. Heinz Company used a lot of these jars, and also the type with the bale tops from the Weir pottery out of Monmouth, Illinois. They used a lot. This one happens to be Mark from Macomb Pottery, and it was patented in 1899.
How did you process with the canning? Did you just sterilize it and boil it and pour it in?
I assume it was pretty much the same way that you did with the conventional glass fruit jars. So
Did it have a band?
it would have had a rubber gasket between that lid.
It's a cute picture too.
Yeah, with the highlight with the blue on it, it also makes it neat. And I don't know if you can see these small jugs here or not, and I think we'll attempt to get the cabinet up here open. And you remember which key that was? Obviously not that one. So you can get an idea of the size of this jug. Now, I don't know how many of you can see what's on this small jug.
Eagle.
And it looks like an eagle, but if you look closely, it's a Maltese cross. The other jug in the cabinet has an open book, like a Bible. On both of these jugs, actually on all three of the jugs I have displayed here, the Lord's Prayer is inscribed on this. These jugs were made by William Robb. Now, he was a potter, and Gene made the somewhat amusing comment that he also made drain tile. Drain tile production paid the bills. He liked to make novelty items like this, which he gave away.
No purpose.
He gave them away as a form of advertising his talent as a potter. No potter has ever figured out his secret of getting the Lord's Prayer inscribed on an item that small. You need a magnifying glass to read it, obviously. And a professor from UNI, well, actually is the state teacher, Iowa State Teachers College in Cedar Falls. When they sold William Robb's property, there was a shed out back, and this particular professor bought the shed and the contents for $40-some.
Oh.
Now keep in mind, this is in the 1960s. So the $40 in the 1960s is a little higher than what you think now. Inside this shed were these jugs that he hadn't given away yet, and the machine he used to make them. The process for making them, however, was not there, the instructions. So nobody ever found out how he did it. But they're just unbelievably small, and the workmanship is incredible if you look at those. This was a Christmas present to my wife, so you know, I've collected the stoneware for quite some time, but she's also become addicted to it. So.
Where's the writing, Mike?
The writing is hard to see. It is, if you look real close, I'll see if you can see it on the other one. It's probably a little more prominent on the other one. You know, Lord's Prayer is somewhat lengthy, so it's hard to see. I mean, you can't see it without a magnifying glass, Gene.
I think my eyes are getting old anyway.
Oh,
I couldn't see.
I've only been, with the magnifying glass, I can only make out about one or two of the words.
See it.
What I need is a higher powered magnifying
I
glass.
could just see stuff there.
I'll let you folks pass that one around. I'll let you pass that around.
Yeah, okay.
Now, if you have any other questions about any other of the stoneware that we have here, please feel free to ask. And
Flask.
oh, the little flask, okay. This would have been nice for me to have brought this last month's program because it has Civil War ties. The G.A.R., the Grand Army of the Republic. This was made for the annual encampment that they had at Davenport in 1900. And Augustus Wentz, now I'm not sure who Mr. Wentz was. I haven't researched that far. He had these canteens made, and the canteen has a very high symbolic meaning with the Civil War.
Whiskey.
No, for water. After a battle and the wounded and the dying are laying on the field, one of the cries for water was one of the common things that you heard. And one of the stories that gets passed down through the years is a soldier kneeling down. Doesn't matter from which side, but to offer a dying soldier a drink from his canteen. So the canteen is extremely symbolic with the Civil War. But these were made, on the bottom they are stamped, the Henrich Crockery Company, Davenport, Iowa. They are not the ones that made these. White's Pottery Company out of Utica, New York is actually the pottery company that made these. Henrich Crockery Company out of Davenport commissioned the company in Utica, New York to make these for this encampment. But this one still has the original cord with it also. And these do turn up from time to time. You know, they're a nice go with for a Civil War collector, but there aren't that many of them to go around. So. There you go, Mark. Did everyone get a chance to see one of these?
Yeah, we had them.
You had them, okay. Okay.
Are the later Crocks hand-thrown?
The newer Crocks, especially, newer Crocks were handmade to a point. In other words, there was a mold that the clay was put inside, and you'll be able to tell again by the hand marks on the inside, but the outside would be smooth because they used a mold. This one was completely machine made. It was by a jolleying process, and they had a metal blade that went inside that would make the inside shape of this and would rotate the clay against the mold. And you won't see any of the hand turn marks on the insides of the newer Crocks. If you have the white glazed Crocks that maybe say Western Stoneware Company, Ruckles Stoneware Company, Red Wing. I mean, there's a number of stoneware companies after the turn of the century still producing stoneware. They'll be basically smooth. You won't be able to see those hand turn marks. This particular one's from the Plymouth company, which is kind of neat, out of Fort Dodge. See, Fort Dodge Pottery was bought out by Western Stoneware in 1906. There was a big conglomeration to consolidate all the potteries in Illinois, and they also bought the Fort Dodge plant. 8 months after they bought the Fort Dodge plant, it burned down. Which, when you stop and think about, that was a pretty common thing at a stoneware plant. A lot of them did burn down because of the kilns, and they were never. A lot of them were never rebuilt. In this case, the Fort Dodge plant, it was never rebuilt. This one's kind of neat because I've got. And this is kind of a risque card for the time because it's dates to about 1908. And this is a trade card for the Plymouth clay products. And we have a somewhat scantily clad lady here for the times on a boat dock. But the traveling salesman more than likely gave these out to people that would buy these type of products. And that's why trade cards from the stoneware industry are much harder to come by. You just don't, you see lots of trade cards, but rarely do you see one from a stoneware company.
Now, what about that little blue deal over there in your shelf there to the far left? Is that a, yes, what's that?
This mug, that's also made by the Henrich Crockery Company. Doesn't have any ties with the canteen, but it's made by this, was put out by the same company.
Is it a toothpick holder? What is it?
It's actually probably, it's one of those promotional things that they probably gave away. And it's a miniature.
Stein.
Yeah,
I
it's
see the handle
yeah,
now.
it's a miniature Stein, and then it has the mark on there. And as far as it being a match holder, that's probably a one item that probably could have well been useful.
Now, were they always glazed, and is that what made them waterproof?
They glazed a majority of it because that did make it waterproof and acid proof as well.
So they glazed the inside too?
The insides are almost always glazed as well, because stoneware, if it's not glazed, is going to be somewhat porous. In other words, it'll absorb whatever particular liquid that you happen to have in it. Some of them will absorb it anyway if the glazing is not real good. I've had some jugs that you clean them off, they put oil in them. And you clean them off and you think you got it all off, you come back a day or two later and the film's back on the outside of the jug. It just keeps seeping out through the jug, which means they didn't get a very good glaze on it.
But is that a tumwa? That little chunk there?
Yeah, this is, they call these, they'll call them either flour scoops or sugar scoops. And it's most likely used at the grocery store. See, the grocery store would buy in bulk. They would buy a barrel of sugar. J.G. Hutchison was a wholesale grocer. So they probably, at some point in time, as a promotional gimmick, gave these out. And keep in mind the cost. This probably only cost J.G. Hutchison.
Are they thick? Not too bad, so they wouldn't be too heavy to scoop.
Right. So anyway, these are probably given with the barrel to scoop out, to measure out the sugar or the flour at the grocery store.
Weigh a certain amount?
I don't know. This was a mold-made piece, which means each one would be...
I meant the content.
Oh, the
When you
content.
made a scoopful, you probably had a...
The grocer probably knew how much to get in each one for so many pounds. You know, that's just one of those things that has, you know, from the experience, you'd say, well, half full, that, you know, that's the 2 pounds worth or whatever. So that particular piece happens to be made in Crooksville, Ohio. They made a lot of stoneware for wholesale grocers.
Well, how did they ship that, in sawdust or what?
That's a good question. You had to ship it by the carload. In other words, the freight company, the railroad company, they didn't want to mess around with just a few. And what they did is they would tell you that you had to ship like 20,000 gallons. That would fill approximately a carload. And they would just throw straw, loose straw in between. Oh. So you've got a railroad car full of stoneware and loose straw, and obviously there's going to be some breakage. And they tried to anticipate that. That was one of the demises of the stoneware market, because in the 1920s, mid-1920s, the railroad company started saying, you have to start crating all your stoneware. Well, that was a substantial cost. And that started putting some of the stoneware companies out of business. One of the companies that put out of business, they're not a stoneware company, but the Heston company, they used to just ship their jugs loose on the railroad cars, you know, with the straw. They started telling them they had to crate them, and that was an additional cost. So, while I'm down here, I'll pull out one well, this is one of these lard buckets.
Oh, yeah.
And Gene pointed this one out because it's got this amusing slogan on it, W.E. Zimbeck, an unusual name, the butcher, the baker, the grocer, from Boone, Iowa. So you get all three in one store. So, and keep in mind, these are promotional items that they gave away at Christmas time to the good customers.
Yes.
And, you know, like I said, for that extra penny a gallon, he could order these with his name on it. And what better way to have advertising than to have this piece in the housewife's home where she sees Mr. Zimbeck's name every day. Oh yeah, I got to go back to his store to get this. So it's a very, very good means of advertising. Now this is another wholesale grocer company, but if you look here, they've got the price of their coffee, 20 cents per package. I'm glad their prices didn't fluctuate a whole lot back then, because after making an order of, you know, they had to have ordered 1,000 of these at least to avoid the stamp charge. Hopefully their prices didn't go up after they got the Crocks in. So, of course, back then there wasn't that much inflation that quick, so they probably didn't have to worry about that. And we've got kind of another local piece here, Sherman Unkrich, Birmingham, Iowa. And it's on this another little butter tub or lard tub. Like I said, these could be used for a variety of things. But
Now, was that made someplace else?
this was made at the Ruckles Pottery in Illinois. And it's not marked as such, but these points coming down from the rim, that's pretty characteristic of their pottery. And a lot of their items were in a blue glaze. This is a pretty plain piece, really. Even the advertising, this doesn't stand out, but it's kind of a neat piece because it's local. Yeah, somebody mentioned the bean pots. The bean pots are pretty common for an advertising medium. And that's another advantage of stoneware. You can cook in these. These could be set right on the stove, and they could be used for cooking purposes. In fact, you can see they'll either have toes, and this one has the ribs on it. So it wouldn't get the piece of stoneware itself that hot, because what would happen eventually is you'd cause it to crack. So that's why these are on there. But they're usually from small towns. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of that particular town, Verina, but from the Fitzgerald, Briardale. Now that might be a familiar name to some. So that was a grocery store chain, correct? Okay. Okay, that pretty much sums up the display and the program that I have. So if you have any other questions.
Did you ever get any sleepy eye vases?
I have a sleepy eye bowl. I didn't bring it. I tried to bring a wide variety.
Well, there's a lot of sleepy eye pitchers, water pitchers.
Right.
These are tall vases.
Right, tall glazes with, and they have colors similar to this on them. The neat story that goes with the Sleepy Eye Milling Company out of Sleepy Eye, Minnesota, they would send their barrels of flour to the grocer, and when we'd take the wooden barrel top off, there would be this pitcher or this vase or these bowls, and they would give those away to the grocer. Now, what the Sleepy Eye Company got in trouble for was that bowl was counted as part of the weight. So they were shaving a few pounds off the flour of each shipment they sent, and before they finally caught on what was going on. So,
Wasn't such a gift after.
right, it wasn't really a gift after all. So,
I have a couple questions.
okay.
Do you know like an approximate time when the machine-made pottery started to take place?
Right around the turn of the century. That was, some places started a little sooner. Most of the potteries in Iowa, Fort Dodge area is probably the only one that actually is using the machine process. All the others were still using the hand turn methods if they hadn't already gone out of business by then. Pottery fell out of favor because of the soon-to-be, we'll say, modern conveniences such as glass, metal containers, eventually plastic. Stoneware is no longer a needed medium.
It isn't manufactured today at all.
It is manufactured today for like canisters, for flour, more for decorative purposes. But the other thing, I don't know how many of you ever picked up a 5-gallon jug or a 20-gallon crock. A 5-gallon jug, empty. is heavy. So you fill that with a liquid, and they were bulky. They were heavy. So, I'm sorry. I'm get his question now. You had another question.
Coal, was that ever used in their firing? And if so, why not?
If coal was available in that area, the Wattier pottery, Wattier was a pretty, well, there's lots of adjectives I could use to describe the town during its coal mining days, but that was a big coal mining town. The Wattier pottery is also located there. That particular pottery had access to coal as opposed to the wood. Now, when you get back to the 1860, 1870 time period, timber was a readily available product for burning purposes. So that's what was more commonly used. But yeah, coal was used somewhat.
Do you have any examples of a glaze that had been fired with coal?
Uh,
I was just wondering if that would make it more valuable to a collector due to maybe the reaction of the glaze.
Not really. The glazes have a lot to do with, and the glazes were a closely kept secret. In fact, when a potter would leave one pottery and go to another, a lot of time he would take his recipe for the glaze with him and not tell the owner. This caused for some hard feelings sometimes. He would also borrow some of the molds and some of the designs. That's why sometimes you'll see Red Wing Cobalt decorations that are attributed to Red Wing end up showing up on Iowa pieces because that particular potter moved. Well, he just copied the designs. So it was kind of a close family, but there were, like I said, the recipes for the glazes, that was a closely kept secret. In fact, they didn't write them down a lot of times, so they couldn't be stolen, believe it or not. So.
My question was, that dark brown, that has such a short spigot on it. Wouldn't that be difficult to pour out?
Right, I agree. That's what's unusual about it. It has such a small opening in it because it's, but the Stallarns jugs, and there are a few of those around, that's pretty much their style of jug. So, yeah, that is unusual. That is unusual.
Mike, you have some common pieces of the ink bottles and also the beer bottles on the bottom sitting on the floor. How were those made?
Okay. We'll take a couple here. This is a sided bottle. When I say sided, it's 12-sided. And this is an 1860s, 1870s stoneware bottle. It was actually mold made. It was made in a mold, and if you were to examine this stoneware bottle closely, you would see the mold lines on it. It was made in two halves, and then those were put together, and the seams were smoothed out. These typically held sarsaparilla or lemon beer. This is a real common product for those. And if you can visualize, you look at the size of the blob lip on that drinking out of a container like this. So that one we can pass around if you'd like. I don't know if this is answering your question or not. And then this is a soda bottle. And this one happens to be English, and I just brought it along because it's a different example. The English used stoneware for soda containers almost exclusively. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different examples from England with all these fancy trademarks and logos on them. They use these rather extensively. They're being imported in the United States because they're attractive looking, and there's lots of varieties.
And how are they made?
This particular one is made in a mold, but it's hand turned. Now, when you take this top, and if I get a shoulder jug, because they're both made basically the same way. If you can visualize this jug without its top, you basically have a crock. That's what was made first, the bottom, in a mold. The inside was probably hand turned. The top part was made in a separate mold. Then that was put on top of this crock, and that was smoothed out. And then the handle was hand applied. That's how most of the shoulder jugs, this is a shoulder jug because of the squared off corner, and those are the beehives. This is a shoulder jug, and that's basically the difference in the manufacture. This is a newer style. This small bottle was probably made the same way. The bottom and the top were probably made separate. I will show one more of the bottles because it's kind of amusing. The mark's a little hard to see, but this is a small beer bottle or ale bottle, and it's debossed Franz's, and then the next word is S-I-V-U-X, and then city. When Mr. Franz sent off his order for the bottles, his handwriting evidently wasn't too good because the potter made the stamp engraved, he spelled Sioux, S-I-V-U-X, for Sioux City. And Mr. J. Franz was a fairly successful brewer in Sioux City during the 1870s and 1880s before the Clark Bill in 1886 eventually shut him down. So Iowa had numerous prohibitions, by the way. So we're rather notorious history as far as that's concerned.
Now, on that shoulder jug, is that Salt-Glazed all the way around? Or is that zinc glaze?
This is the Bristol or the zinc glaze.
And then the top is...
And the top is the Albany slip.
Okay.
So you had, first they poured it inside, then poured that out, dipped the jug in deep enough to get the top glazed, took a sponge and cleaned off that shoulder. And the main reason they did that is so they could stack a crock on there, because if that was glazed and they stuck a crock on there, it'd stick to it and they wouldn't be able to get them apart after the firing process. So that's why that shoulder is unglazed, so they could stack more items on it in the kiln. And the bottoms usually have a place where it's been wiped off, and this one the rim has been wiped off for the same reason. This is glazed, but the rim is unglazed. Well, I'm in the process of writing one book, and I would like to get one on stoneware as well. Here's a kind of an interesting thing to look at. It's supposed to be round, I would think, if you look at the shape. We got almost an oval here. Whoever was carrying the stoneware to the drying shed evidently picked it up by the handles and kind of squeezed it in a little bit. So it's not quite round anymore. So. Yeah, now that is where some of the inside glaze has come off over the years.
One thing in it, that's a dark brown glaze inside.
On the inside, that was pretty common to have the Albany slip on the inside.
That's very popular for making turnip kraut. It makes better kraut if it's made in a kraut that's glazed brown on the inside.
Is that right? I hadn't heard that before. So that's one of those interesting tidbits that you need to put in the books. So.
Did lead play a role in these glazes at all?
Yes, they did. So that leads to other hazards that people were unaware of. The Galena pottery in Galena, Illinois used almost exclusively lead in their glazes. I really don't have an example here that would typify a lead glaze, but there'll be more of a brilliant reddish colored glaze. But yeah, they used lead oxides in the glazes.
And the inside too?
Probably not. The exterior, yes, almost exclusively in Galena. So, but hopefully not on the inside. So, but still, the people that worked with it, that was a hazard.
It's a neat picture.
The blue one up there, yeah, and the potters knew that. They knew that the housewives, that was an attractive form, so they knew what they were doing. So.
Yep.
Well, Mike, we want to thank you for this great program. Just remind our viewers on FPAC that we have an open house the first, what is this, Sunday of every month?
Right.
I can't believe it's February already. And do we know what the program next week is, or next month?
Trees Comiskey.
Ah, that's right. Therese Comiskey from the county park will talk about our wildlife exhibits here. So y'all come. Thanks again, Mike.
You bet. Thanks, Mark.